Way. Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to our third webinar on Tauranga's response to the Government Direction for Growth. We are rapidly approaching the notification date, so it is timely that we provide our stakeholders with another update. My name is Craig McKibben, and I'm the Engagement Lead for the Enabling Housing Supply Plan Change, known as Proposed Plan Change 33. Like previous webinars, we will have you muted for the duration, but you'll be able to post questions and I'll explain how shortly. The webinar is being recorded and we will post a link out for those who are unable to attend. As an attendee, we have none of your personal details, so there is no privacy risk to you by having this session recorded. Shortly, I'll be handing over to Janine Speedy, Team Leader City Planning, who will give you a rundown of the proposed changes to the Tauranga City Plan under Plan Change 33 and the upcoming notification process. At the end of today's presentation, we will have a Q&A session, as no doubt there will be plenty of questions about the proposed changes to the City Plan. You will see on the right-hand side of your screen a Q&A column where you can type in questions. No one else will see the questions being asked, but we will read these out and respond to them. We aim to complete the webinar by 1 o'clock, but if there's a few more questions to answer, then we'll happily let it run a little longer. So I will now hand it over to Janine.
Thanks, Craig. Kia ora koutou, and yeah, thanks again for everyone that's attending this webinar today. So as Craig outlined, I'll be working through and giving a brief overview of how we've approached the implementation of the Amendment Act. And I'll be doing that, zone by zone, and some other relevant sections of the city plan. So the first zone that I wanted to talk to was the medium density residential zone. So within this, this covers really large areas of our city. And it will really cover areas that are currently the suburban residential, Wairakei residential and large lot residential zones. And what we're proposing to do is rezone these to the medium density residential zone. And these excuse me, these areas are where the MDRZ will be enabled as a permitted activity, but it is really not areas that we would anticipate to see higher density, such as apartments in these areas. The reason why we've gone through to rezone these to medium density residential zone is, one, to reflect the national planning standards, and also really to try and reduce the duplication within the plan, as the medium density residential standards must be applied to all of our relevant residential zones. So with rezoning the suburban residential, Wairakei and large lot, this means that our current sections 14B and 14F, we're proposing to delete those completely and provide a new section within Chapter 14, which would be Section 14G for the medium residential zone. So as I said, that will be where the medium density residential standards as set out in the plan, so the full set of the density standards will be proposed, and that is a permitted activity, and enables it up to 3 dwellings as a permitted activity. We're also proposing to include some what we're calling supporting provisions to support that, and those relate to waste management areas. So in terms of having a site that can be a bit more constrained in terms of having those 3 dwellings, making sure that there is waste management areas to accommodate our council bins, and also we're proposing a front fence height, and that's to ensure that there's passive surveillance with the street. And lastly, we are proposing a minimum size of dwelling, and that just relates to a studio and 1 bedroom, and then 2 bedrooms or more. So those 3 provisions really came through from what we had proposed through Plan Change 26. With the introduction of the medium density residential standards and the new heights that are permitted through the medium density residential standards, we are proposing that the current permitted intrusions that sit in Chapter 4 will be removed, and so will not apply to the medium density residential zone. If you don't comply with one of those medium density residential standards, this is a restricted discretionary activity, and we're non-notified, and so there'll be matters of discretion for each of those. Within this zone, if you are proposing 4 or more dwellings, resource consent will be required. It will be a restricted discretionary activity and non-notified if you meet all the requirements. So it's basically the building envelope provisions that are set out within the plan. And so, yeah, those will all still apply in terms of still need to meet your setbacks, your height, overshadowing, etc. In addition, if you are proposing to do 4 or more dwellings on a site, there will be a requirement to prepare an urban design assessment and also to complete transport and infrastructure capacity assessments. That general rule framework in terms of what will be considered through the urban design assessment and the infrastructure was proposed through Plan Change 26. So we're really looking to pull a lot of that through. There was some refinement as a result of submissions that we've received for Plan Change 26. So we've tried to pull this through for these plan changes as well. For those of you who really get into the nitty-gritty or the detail of the city plan, where there is a scheduled site in the city plan, so like an example would be the Shane Road Hospital, private hospital, there's specific rules that relate to that plan for those non-residential activities which are sit in what's called a scheduled site. So where there's a scheduled site that applies to a property, those will all be retained and they are carried through into the medium density residential zone. The Amendment Act is really clear in terms of we cannot deal with or make changes to non-residential activity provisions. So for those provisions, they have been carried through and will apply within the medium density residential zone. So that's things like your home-based business and your homestay, visitor accommodation, those are all pulled through. So that's medium density residential zone. It largely covers large parts of the city. It really relates to the suburban residential, Wairakei residential and large lot residential. But that is only, I suppose, it doesn't apply where we're giving effect to Policy 3, and that's where the proposed high density residential zone comes in. So the high density residential zone is proposed to give effect to Policy 3. So it is surrounding those commercial centres that have been identified through the criteria. So we've done a previous webinar on how we've assessed and looked at those centres and identified those that are appropriate for residential intensification surrounding them. Just to be really clear, this is not, that process was not to establish a commercial hierarchy, it was purely to understand areas or locations across the city that were appropriate to accommodate residential intensification. So when we talk about residential intensification, that's 4 or more stories, you're looking at apartments. And we've also looked at a walkable catchment, which has taken into account things like topography, accessibility, and whether the footpath is formed and well lit and accessible. So that's also been taken into consideration. So this table here gives you a brief overview of where we have reached in terms of what we're proposing. So we did a lot of work through Plan Change 26 along the Te Papa Peninsula. So that's giving effect to Policy 3, which is that 1,500 walkable catchment around the city centre. And also the Cameron Road corridor is where we'll be enabling 27 metres or proposing to enable 27 metres, which is about 8 stories. There are transitional heights, so where we have 8 stories along the Cameron Road corridor, those transition down to the medium density residential standards. So there is a transition from 8 to 6 and 4 and down to 3. Our urban communities team, they've done a lot of work on the Otomoto spatial plan, which has been out for consultation and feedback, and we've been working really closely with them for them to feed through the work that they have done in terms of additional heights and where that's located. So those are really identified around Cherrywood, Brookfield and the southern side of Beretta, and that's where we're proposing between a 400 and 800 and a range of heights through there. We've done also a lot of work around the Mount Maunganui, so it's identified as a town centre, and we have done additional work in terms of landscape and quite a bit of tangata whenua consultation. So what we're proposing is that the high density residential zone extent of that zone in that area will not change, but we will apply what we're proposing through this high density residential zone. The heights will remain, so in terms of the height plan area will remain. We will enable the MDRZ through that location, but we do acknowledge that we are proposing to do the Mount Spatial Plan, and that's where there is some areas that we will probably need to revisit and look at additional whether additional height is appropriate and the extent. So that's really looking at Mount Drury to Sutherland, and it was really clear in terms of our consultation, especially tangata whenua consultation, that further work and some detailed spatial planning needed to be done in that section. And then we move on to our local and town centres, and that's where we've got those 400 and 800 walkable catchments, and we're proposing those 4 and 6 stories around those centres. So in terms of high density residential zone, the city living zone will be deleted, and the current Mount high density residential zone will be deleted and moved all into a new high density residential zone, which will be in section 14H. Again, the MDRZ applies as a permitted activity as set out in the Act. There is one exception that we're proposing, so where we can be more enabling, we're proposing for site coverage not to apply in the high density residential zone, and that's really to provide some more enablement to get that additional height. Just remember that things like your landscaping area will still apply that is set out in the MDRZ, so those will still need to be covered. Very similar to the medium density residential zone, we're proposing that the permitted intrusions don't apply within the zone. So the absolute height that is provided within the zone is what applies. So for example, the 27 metres for 8 stories, 21 metres for 6 stories, that is the height that is provided for. There's no permitted intrusions included. Very similar again to medium density residential zone, we are going proposing 4 or more dwellings or 4 or more stories. It will be a restricted discretionary non-notified activity. I suppose the key difference within the high density residential zone is that for 3 or more stories, we are proposing additional or providing for that additional height and a more enabling height in relation to boundaries, so that overshadowing rule. And so that's to obviously enable that greater height within that high density residential zone. So Appendix 4Q within the city plan will show the maps. And so it will show the extent and also the height map, so what height is enabled within that zone, within that specific area. It's probably a good time to note here that we are preparing and we will have a GIS viewer. So the GIS viewer will enable you to search any property. You'll see the proposed zone. You'll also see what the proposed height is, so you can understand how it may apply to a particular property. And then we'll also have layers about qualifying matters, which I'll talk to in a minute. In terms of the assessment criteria, it will look very similar in terms of there's an urban design assessment, and we also need to understand infrastructure capacity within the area, especially in terms of that 3 waters. So that rule has also been pulled through in terms of Plan Change 26. Our infrastructure team have done a lot of work, and they've been mapping to understand where across our city we may have potential, or we know have non-infrastructure capacity constraints in terms of our three waters, and are looking at LTP investment to upgrade those areas to be able to provide that capacity. So that is information that will be provided as we work along. Scheduled sites will also be retained, but it also, as I said, in terms of our limitations on those non-residential activities, we've needed to create what we call precincts. So the city living, residential and mixed use zones, and also for Mount Maunganui, they all have precinct specific rules that relate to non-residential activities, and that's all set out within that high density residential zone, so they're 14H. As part of the plan change, and this is again, it is relevant or aligns with our approach that we have for Plan Change 26, or had for Plan Change 26, is we have the residential outcomes framework. It's a non-statutory urban design guide, so the purpose for that is that we can continue to update it, we can continue to review it and make sure that it's really responding to built form outcomes. Where it relates to the city plan or the proposed plan change is that the objectives, policies and assessments are all reflected from they really link to that residential outcomes framework. So the residential outcomes framework is really for the ability for you to say, well, how can I achieve an objective or a policy or an assessment criteria that is set out within the plan in terms of urban design. This has been updated to reflect the medium density residential standards and the Amendment Act and the changes that Council's been required to meet. And so we do welcome any feedback that you may have as part of that process in terms of how we can update it and approve it. Some of you might be already aware, but we do have an urban design panel. Well, we are in the process of setting up an urban design panel, so Council's provided the direction to set that up. So we're looking at having that set up for when these applications start to come through. So the next zone to really talk about is the commercial zone. So the proposed changes to this zone to remove our density limits that currently sit for residential activities, but also as part of that is require a resource consent for any residential activities. And so that's through restricted discretionary non-notified, and really push that residential above ground level. In terms of the residential assessment criteria, it's quite similar to the other residential zones, but it's really focused more on that on-site amenity for residents rather than that off-site amenity. If you're in a commercial zone or have a property in a commercial zone that is identified as one of those commercial centres that is surrounded by high density residential zone, you will be, we're proposing to enable that additional height. So for example, Bayfair, it's identified as a town centre. We're proposing the high density residential zone surrounding it, so enabling that 6 stories, 21 metres. So the commercial zone will have a link to that same Appendix Q, and will be enabling that, that additional height. So that's so you don't get a donut effect where you get less height within the centre and then increased height around the centre. The last zone just to talk through with you is the city centre zone. So the city centre zone, we are required to review that, and that was to give effect to policy 3A. And 3A is, in the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, is to provide as much development capacity as possible. So we have reviewed that. At the moment, how that section or that zone works is that it's a permitted activity. There is a height limit, but there's very little urban design controls. So what we're proposing is to remove the height limits along or within quite a core of the city living, of the city centre zone, but require a resource consent. And so that's to bring in more urban design requirements, but still be able to retain that flexibility. So rather than having too many rules as a permitted activity to achieve, everything would be restricted, discretionary, non-notified, more urban design controls, but to also provide the flexibility to be able to have good outcome designs. One thing to just remember in terms of that city centre zone is that you do have your airport flight path and you do have view shafts, so that will limit your height or put you into a separate or an additional consenting process, which for the airport is generally the lower of those heights, which is 48.7 metres above your ground level. Just moving on to qualifying matters, which I think has been an interest for many in terms of how council are proposing to apply this. So for the qualifying matters, a qualifying matter is where council may reduce height or density, and we have looked at, we've required to review or relook at our existing qualifying matters and justify our qualifying matters that already sit within the plan. So there are 16 qualifying matters that already sit within the plan that we have set out within a volume in the section 32. So that's things that you can see in the presentation now, which is, our existing view shafts, outstanding natural features, significant Māori areas. They will all be retained within the plan as currently operative. We are proposing 3 new qualifying matters. So one is the national grid, which sits across Pools Road. So the real change in that is at the moment it's a restricted discretionary activity, and we propose to amend that to non-complying, and that's through some engagement we've done with Transpower and to reflect the requirements of the NES. So yeah, it's not a change in extent or anything, it's just a change in activity status. The next one, which is a new qualifying matter, is the Pukahinahina. So Pukahinahina is a significant cultural site along Cameron Road, the Battle of Gate Pa. We've been engaging with tangata whenua in terms of that area. And so what we're proposing is to limit height adjacent to that, that site, and to provide transitional heights up to the 28 metres. So MDRZ, so the 12 or 11 3 stories will be proposed directly adjacent, and then that will increase up to 27 metres, and that's really to reduce overlooking and not to dominate the site itself. The last proposed, new qualifying matter is really reflection on the way that the Amendment Act is written in terms of how we deal with qualifying matters. So because Plan Change 27 is subject to appeals, that means it's not operative, and therefore it needs to be treated as a new qualifying matter. So that's that flooding from intense rainfall. It still has legal effect, it still applies, but because it has those Environment Court appeals, it means that we have to treat it as a new qualifying matter. So I'll move on now to some other relevant sections of the plan where we're making some amendments, which is one is the transportation. So we are proposing amendments to some objectives and policies within the transportation section, and that's better to align with the no car parking requirements in the NPSUD. So we took those minimum requirements out a couple of years ago now, but yeah, have undertaken a bit of a review to make sure that we're fully aligning with the NPSUD. We've also reviewed the access rule, private right-of-ways rule, to better manage and consider intensification along those right-of-ways. And then lastly, we, as set out in Plan Change 26, we're proposing to have new bicycle parking rules to really encourage and provide for more multimodal options within these new developments. The other pretty significant, amendments that have been made to propose the city plan is really the subdivision chapter. So the Amendment Act is pretty clear in terms of what we must do to the subdivision section of our plan, and there's really 3 pathways that we need to provide within our subdivision provisions. One is a vacant lot subdivision. So at the moment we do have a minimum lot size of 325 for generally our residential zones. we are proposing to make some changes to that vacant lot and deal with it through a shape factor rather than a minimum lot size. And so that's really to ensure that you've got usable land where a house can be established. And so that shape factor will be needs to be free or clear of any, easements or difficult topography. So that is a pretty key change that we're proposing. The second pathway is to subdivide around lawfully established dwellings. So where you may have an existing dwelling on the site, the ability to subdivide around that, and that's where we'll be really considering the existing, well, the rules that are set out within the MDRZ. So that is, we're looking at things like setback and that you can still accommodate your outdoor living, your landscaping area, etc. So that's that second pathway. And then the third pathway that we'll be providing for is where that subdivision implements a land use consent or is part of a land use consent. So those will be proposed within both that medium density residential zone and high density residential zone. Another change is obviously, is that secondary independent dwelling. So with the MDRZ coming in, it's far more enabling than what is provided for in our secondary independent dwelling unit rule. So it really doesn't have or provide any function anymore. So what we're proposing within that subdivision chapter is that you can now obviously subdivide around it if you established a secondary independent dwelling prior to this plan change coming in. And that's where you'd really take that second pathway, which is new boundaries around existing dwellings. So I'll just move on now to legal effect. So the medium density residential standards will have legal effect from the 20th of August. That's required by the Act, or the Amendment Act was brought in, sections 86BA. So those are where those density standards are within Schedule A, so those which we've talked about in previous webinars. Section 86BA makes it clear that it doesn't apply to a site or part of a site that's subject to a qualifying matter. So if you're affected by a qualifying matter, then those MDRZ do not have legal effect. One thing that we've done looked into a little bit more, I suppose, is in terms of view shafts. So just to be really clear, the qualifying matter is only where you encroach into that qualifying matter in terms of that view shaft. So if you are proposing a medium density residential standard and it sits underneath that view shaft, that legal effect will still apply. I think what's really important here is that the legal effect legislation is extremely difficult in terms of it probably hasn't been drafted great, and yeah, puts in a really hard basket in terms of we really need to review or you need to consider whether something has legal effect by site or the activity, because it is difficult. But yeah, so just to be clear, yes, the MDRZ has legal effect, but you really need to consider the site where you're applying it and making sure that all of those, how that legal effect applies to that particular property. All the other rules of the plan, so what I've talked through in terms of, our transportation, our assessment criteria, our proposed subdivision, they are subject to the normal test of legal effect. So where we're going in terms of our next key steps, so you're all aware. So tomorrow, by the end of the day, the council agenda for the council meeting on Monday will be live. So that council agenda will have the proposal to adopt Plan Change 33 for notification. It will include a link that will take you to the Section 32, the appendices, and all the proposed annotated text, so maps, so that's text and maps. With the Section 32, because of the size of it, we have cut it into volumes to try and ease ease of the reader. So you'll see that there's a volume for the residential zones, commercial zones, city centre zone, transport zone or transport provisions, and also qualifying matters. So yeah, that will all be live by the end of tomorrow, all going well, or it should be, it will be. The other kind of key report that we need to take up on the 15th of August is to withdraw Plan Change 26. The reasons are given within the report, but it really looks to the geographic extent and the zones that apply that we have to give or make changes to give effect or implement that Amendment Act. So it is just so much larger than Plan Change 26. We will be proposing to withdraw that plan change. We also have had quite a bit of advice in terms of the impervious surface rule that has been proposed through Plan Change 27. So this was proposed, it sits within Chapter 14. And given the significant changes that we're required to make to that chapter in terms of deleting all of our existing or many of our existing provisions and proposing a new 14G and 14H, given that quite significant change, our advice is that we should withdraw the impervious surface rule, and then we'll propose to re-notify that through Plan Change 33 for public notification. All going well, on the 15th, we will have the website live on the 17th, so that's Wednesday the 17th, and that will update the website with a significant amount of information in terms of the changes we're making. That will have the GIS viewer that I talked about, which will provides you the opportunity to search any zone, to look at the qualifying matters, to see what the proposed height is, etc. So, and then that will provide links back to the website as well. As part of that public notification, all ratepayers will receive a letter and a fact sheet, and there'll also be some social media and radio ads to provide an update or advise residents of the proposed change. That submission period will close on the 23rd of September, so it's 25 working days to make a submission. All going well and very dependent on the number of submissions that we receive, we will publicly notify that summary of submissions and call for further submissions by the end of this year. All going well. In the next year, so we're looking at June, July, we will have a hearing for these submissions. They will be heard by independent hearings panel. And by the 20th November, so that's a direction that we've been given from the Minister for the Environment, is that by the 20th of November, we must put a report up. So by that point, we need to have our hearings panel recommendations, and we need to put a council report up to either accept or reject that hearings panel recommendation. If we accept it, the process is over, becomes operative. If we reject it, it then goes to the Minister for the Environment for a final decision. That final decision doesn't have a time frame on it, so if we do reject it, it's a bit of a waiting game in terms of where it sits with the Minister. So going forward, there may be some site-by-site questions, there may be queries in terms of some of the approaches or needing more information on the plan change. So this gives you a little bit of an overview in terms of where to direct your queries, just so we can make sure we can try and get the right people answering the questions and making sure we're getting consistency. So for Plan Change 33, if you've got a query about the process in terms of why we've approached certain things, looking for information, you can email our city plan inbox. If you do have a question about whether you do need a resource consent or how a legal effect may apply to a certain property and you're not clear, that's where you can contact the duty planner. Just to be aware that we are expecting that we will get a large amount of queries from both our key stakeholders but also the general community. So just please be patient with us. We're working really hard to try and get a response to you, but if it's not coming as quickly as you'd expected, it will be coming, but our team, both teams, so our environmental planning team and our team, are trying our best to get that response, but we do have we're expecting quite a high level of queries. That third contact there is our friend of the submitter. So that is an independent planning consultant. So they're employed by Ministry for the Environment, so completely separate from council. And they're there to give advice if someone needs any support or direction in terms of how to make a submission. So if there's anyone in that position, they can email the email address, and that person can either ring you back, so the friend of the submitter will ring you back, or provide a response through the email. So that's a snapshot of what Plan Change 33 looks like, how we've proposed to approach the zones and other changes within the plan, and kind of next steps going from here. So yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Janine, and and thank you for that overview, which has been very informative. So we will now hand it over to our stakeholders to ask any questions that they have, and I see these are coming through already, so we'll crack into it. First one, Janine, is, and this relates to historic heritage. Are there any additional provisions in the plan change to support this as a qualifying matter?
Yeah, well, so there's the existing heritage, significant Māori areas, significant archaeological sites that sit within the plan, and those will obviously remain. I suppose there's the Pukahinahina, which I talked about, which is where we're proposing to have transitional heights to protect the significance of that site. And there's also existing kind of height in relation to the elms, and that we're proposing to retain that in terms of the properties that are directly adjacent to the elm site will have the MDRZ rather than enabling that greater height. And that's all set out within volume 6 of the section 32.
Next question here is, on what basis are you able to defer Mount Maunganui under the NPSUD requirements? If it's a centre, can't it only be excluded if qualifying criteria apply? Yep.
So we have done work in terms of the qualifying matters that does remove, wrong wording, but doesn't necessarily remove, it applies the landscape assessment applies the what the proposed or appropriate heights are, and that really relates to Mount Drury to Mowal. I'd hope that everyone can appreciate we've had a very tight time frame to be able to implement this Amendment Act in terms of how we progress this. So where the landscape assessment is, it's really looked at, and there's an area between Mount Drury and Sutherland, which has said, well, this could accommodate additional height, but we've had pretty strong tangata whenua engagement, which has said we need to go through and think carefully and plan this through that design sprint spatial planning process, and also have a really good consideration of the natural hazards that affect that area. This is obviously open to submission. Anyone can make a submission, and I no doubt expect that we'll get submissions in that area, and we will work hard to try and respond to those submissions and see what we can do through the submission process. But we've had a really constrained time to try and get everything ready for notification for the end of the year.
Just in terms of the, you stated earlier on about removing permitted intrusions. Is that in reference to daylight or setback intrusions? Can you provide clarification?
Yep. So in chapter 4 of our plan, we have a permitted intrusions rule. So at the moment, how it works in the suburban residential zone, you've got your 9 metre height limit, and then you can use the permitted intrusions, and that's really to be able to accommodate things like roof design, and for taller buildings, your lift overrun and things. And so we're proposing that permitted intrusion rule that sits within chapter 4, that won't apply to the medium density and high density residential zone. So the architectural testing, particularly that we've undertaken for the high density residential zone, is the absolute height. So that's where we've looked at 6 stories, so 21 metres. The architectural testing has shown that you can actually accommodate that 6 stories within that absolute height of the 21 metres. But those are obviously open to submission. So especially in terms of that high density residential zone, if you don't agree or want us to consider different heights that we've proposed, those are submission matters that you can make a submission on.
Cool, thanks, Janine. Apparently I was a bit muffled before, so hopefully people can hear me a bit better now. The next question is just for four or more dwellings in the medium density residential zone, is there to be a stepped approach in terms of infrastructure and ITA requirements?
Particularly for the ITA requirements, it will reflect Appendix 4K within the plan. So off the top of my head, and don't quote me on this, but I think it's about 15 units where you'll kick into that the first kind of assessment criteria. In terms of the infrastructure capacity, it's not so much stepped, it's just whether there's capacity within the network to support that development or not. And that's where I was saying that the Three Waters team have been doing quite a bit of work to try and understand across the city where we may have constraints and where upgrades may be required to accommodate additional density within an area. It's just really hard it's very hard for council to now plan for intensification when we don't really know where it's going to happen and we don't know when it's going to happen. And that's really, the MDRZ provides quite a bit of uncertainty for council.
Thanks, Janine. And we've still got a bit of time, folks, so if you've got any more questions, please send them through. But the next one here is currently most buildings in the CBD do not require resource consent. So why the change to having that requirement, and what urban design criteria will apply?
Yeah, so at the moment, the city plan or the city centre zone is quite enabling in terms of it does have height limits across a lot of those precincts, but it also is very, I'd say, light in terms of urban design controls. So what we've looked at is that with that increased height, so taking away height limits completely within basically the core, so most of the city centre zone, that any new new buildings require resource consent but have more urban design controls, and it's really just to make sure that we're having good built form outcomes on the ground, and then also to give the ability for that urban design panel to be able to provide feedback, whereas at the moment, and it's that kind of balance in terms of council's requirement to give effect to policy 3A, which is as much development capacity as possible. So our need to actually really remove height, that approach in terms of that consenting approach is pretty consistent across quite a few other councils. So for example, Hamilton City Council have taken that rule framework that it's restricted discretionary for quite a while now, but remember it is also non-notified, so these won't be notified. There's a pretty clear consenting framework, but that ability to make sure that we can assess and have good urban design outcomes on the ground.
Well, thank you. As in regards to, I guess, Plan Change 27 as a qualifying matter, is this all floodable areas or just major overland flow paths? And if it's a floodable area, then what is the impact on potential yield from the medium density rules?
Yeah, so for our flood prone areas, the impact on yield is actually, in terms of the MDRZ, is minimal. It probably won't be at all. So it really does apply to your overland flow paths and floodplains that will have the potential to limit the yield or the density that is enabled within that site.
Okay, cool, thank you. And I think this is maybe a follow-up question to that, but just someone seeking clarification. If the site is shown as being subject to intense rainfall in the council GIS, is it the new standards wouldn't apply to that site?
So I'll aim to answer this question, and if I don't answer it correctly, we've just got to be really clear. So in terms of the MDRZ, so will be applied to all relevant residential zones. So that will apply to our existing suburban residential, Wairaka residential, large lot residential city living and our high density residential zone. So they apply, they're a permitted activity, but you must read the plan in terms of the entire plan. So whether there's any other layers that apply to that property. And so that includes your flooding. And so that may reduce the density that is enabled within that site. So MDRZ is applied as a permitted activity, but you may have other rules. The difference is the legal effect and how the consents team or the environmental planning team are able to consider your MDRZ from the notification date of the 20th of August. So in that instance, if you have you're wanting to progress a MDRZ but are affected by a qualifying matter, that's when we need to, well, the legal effect is considered quite differently, and that's all set out in section 86BA. So hopefully that clarifies that question.
Well, thank you, Janine. Next one in here is what will happen with applications lodged over the next 2 weeks or so in the city living zone? So I guess that's prior to notification.
If it's okay, I'd like to hand that over to someone in the consents team to respond to.
Sure.
Hi everybody, it's Shannon here. For those that are lodged prior to notification of the plan change, your activity status and description of activity will remain the same in accordance with the Act. However, obviously once the plan change is notified, your receiving environment changes with it.
Well, thanks very much, Shannon. And one final question here at the moment is what are the minimum dwelling sizes for studio or single bedroom or 2-bedroom plus dwellings? That's quite a specific one, not sure.
It is, and I apologize whoever posted this, I can't think of it off the top of my head,
Yep.
but all of those provisions will be available at by the end of tomorrow. So if at the end of tomorrow, when the council agenda goes live, if you go into the report, there's a link that takes you to the Plan Change 33 key documents, and that will take you to the section 32, all the annotated text, all the draft maps, all the appendices, so you can see in there what our proposed minimum unit sizes for dwellings.
Hey Janine,
So, yeah.
I've got it open right now.
Oh, you got it.
For
Oh,
those
thanks,
that can't
Shannon.
wait.
Yeah, sorry.
So for the high density residential zone, a studio unit, 35 square meters, one or more bedroom unit, 45 square meters. That's for the high density residential zone. So that gives you a bit of a taste of what's to come.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Shannon, and thank you, Janine, again. So, look, thanks everyone, not only for your time this afternoon, but also for the questions that you've raised. I'm sure plenty of people on the call had similar questions, so this is a good opportunity to hear it straight from the project team. This will be the last formal engagement with stakeholders prior to notification of the plan change later this month, but we'll continue keeping you posted on progress over the coming weeks, including when the plan change is notified, where to find the draft provisions, and how to make a submission. So a big thank you to everyone once again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we will be in touch again soon. Ka kite.